Evidence suggests that there are more genius-level men than women in some of the most notable areas of human endeavor. Do we have to pretend not to know this? And might our society's pretense about female intellectual equality hold a clue to feminist rage? That's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. Recently, I was re-watching a video conversation on TV Ontario's program, The Agenda. It featured University of Toronto psychologist Jordan Peterson, now well known to many of us, and a University of Tel Aviv feminist neuroscientist named Daphne Joel, who claims her research shows that male and female brains are indistinguishable. The feminist professor made two notable claims during the program that represent the standard feminist position on sex differences. The first is that scientific research into innate male-female differences should be seen as, quote, politically illegitimate, in her words. And the second is that even if we had proof of innate cognitive and behavioral sex differences, that wouldn't make any helpful difference to social policy. Her example for this position was that proof of a greater male tendency to aggression shouldn't make any difference to how we raise young men, our practice of teaching young men not to be aggressive. Now, her assumption here is that if we believe that something is biologically determined, then we will see it as unalterable and, in fact, good. But really, we've believed for centuries that men are, in general, more aggressive than women, and we have not only taught cultural values such as self-control and indeed chivalry to men, but have also sought to harness male aggression in socially productive ways. So knowledge and wisdom don't always go together, of course, but there is certainly no evidence that suppression of knowledge leads to wisdom. And it is deplorable to see a scientist declaring certain research out of bounds altogether. But this is now the standard SJW position, that we must suppress the search for knowledge in the name of equality. According to Professor Daphne Joel, research into biological sex differences will always be used for political ends to justify misogyny and discrimination against women and special privileges for men. Like so many feminist assertions that have been generally accepted, this claim's unfalsifiability has not so far weakened its persuasiveness. In other words, it is neither provable nor disprovable, but it feels right, even though it requires us to assume what is patently unlikely, that the majority of non-feminist researchers, both male and female, have some kind of vested interest in justifying inequality. And even though the claim skirts the obvious fact that feminist research will definitely be used for political ends, since that is its declared purpose, to promote feminist conceptions of what society owes women and to make those the foundation of often costly and far-reaching social policies. So why should we be more inclined to trust a feminist researcher with a declared ideological bias than to trust a non-feminist researcher with no declared bias and a dedication to following evidence wherever it leads? Daphne Joel's research has in fact been widely, and as far as I could discover, mostly uncritically reported in major magazines and newspapers across the Western world. Using MRI brain images, she and her team at Tel Aviv University have, it is claimed, found no significant differences between male and female brains. According to a late 2015 report in the magazine Science, the majority of male and female brains studied by Joel's researchers were a mosaic of male and female structures. Here's the key quotation from the report. Quote, depending on whether the researchers looked at gray matter, white matter, or the diffusion tensor imaging data, between 23% and 53% of brains contained a mix of regions that fell on the male end and female end of the spectrum. Very few of the brains, between 0% and 8%, contained all male or all female structures. End quote. I make no claim to being capable of evaluating this finding, but I can say that the manner in which the information is presented seems to me at best unhelpful and at worst deliberately misleading. For one, it is not at all clear whether brain structure is the sole or primary determinant of male-female cognitive difference. For another, the percentages cited in the report do not clearly make the case we're told they make. To say that depending on what variable is studied, 23% to 53% of brains contained a mix of male and female regions doesn't prove that male and female brains are indistinguishable. The numbers reveal that depending on the variable, a large majority of brains, as high as 77%, if I'm doing the math correctly, did not contain much of a mix. Tell me, am I wrong? It is stated that between 0 and 8% of brains contained all male or female structures, but I would like to know what percentage contained a preponderance of male or female structures. Why are we not told that? It would certainly seem to make logical sense that male and female brains would share many structural features, since many of the things men and women have to do in life are the same. But it also makes sense that there would be some significant general differences given our sexual differences. The research is presented in such a manner to prevent readers from thinking well about the reported findings. And even more than this, I'm struck by the totalizing tenor of Professor Joel's own conclusions about her findings. Usually, scientists worthy of the name are very conservative in the conclusions they're willing to draw from their research. They are scrupulous about not concluding more than the findings will strictly authorize. But not so Daphne Joel. She essentially declares that as a result of her work, research into sex differences in the brain is all but over. She actually has the temerity to say that from now on, this is what she says, quote, researchers studying the brain may not need to compare males and females when analyzing their data. For another, she says, the extreme variability of human brains undermines the justifications for single-sex education based on innate differences between males and females, and perhaps even undermines our definitions of gender as a social category, end quote. That was all a quotation from Professor Daphne Joel. I've never before heard of a serious scientist declaring that her research results are so conclusive that other researchers should simply stop pursuing related research. This goes beyond confidence well into totalitarian arrogance. And unfortunately, it's not surprising that the same professor who deplored the use of scientific research for, quote, political ends immediately moved to give her research a political application, in this case to discredit single-sex schools despite their beneficial impacts, and to support the feminist claim that gender is a social construct. Such statements certainly make me wonder whether Daphne Joel shouldn't be regarded as an ideologue rather than a real scientist, though you wouldn't know that from the credulous manner in which her pronouncements have been generally received. And you certainly wouldn't know of the mountain of evidence documenting the cognitive and behavioral differences between male and female, some of it pretty difficult to refute through the social constructionist lens, such as that research cited by Professor Jordan Peterson in the Agenda program that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. He refers to a study by Simon Baron-Cohen showing fairly marked sex differences in one-day-old male and female infants. The fact that Joel never acknowledges this work seems a remarkably unscientific position. For a very different approach to sex distinctions in cognition, consider the work of Doreen Kimura, who was a PhD in psychobiology and a professor at the University of Western Ontario, and whose book Sex and Cognition represents a lifetime's worth of objective research into the neural and hormonal bases of behavioral and cognitive sex differences. Unlike Professor Joel, whose ideological agenda is clear, Professor Kimura pursued her research to increase human knowledge, not because she began with a cherished theory that she was determined to support. Through a multitude of controlled tests in problem solving, memory, and other cognitive abilities, Kimura's research found that on average, men outperformed women in a variety of spatial tasks, especially involving identifying objects in altered orientations. Men also excelled at tests of mathematical reasoning. This is worth emphasizing. Men excelled at tests of mathematical reasoning, with the differences between the sexes most remarkable when it comes to the most brilliant mathematicians. Women, in contrast, were generally better able to recall the spatial layout of an array of objects, to scan arrays quickly to find matching objects, and to recall words. Kimura found that such sex differences, which occur across cultures, usually begin at an early age, before puberty, and last a lifetime. Unlike Tel Aviv University's Daphne Joel, Western University's Doreen Kimura was never interested in dictating what kind of research other scientists should pursue, or how society at large could make use of scientific findings. She co-founded the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship to protect the freedom of scholars to pursue the research that most interested them. She was one of the few brave souls to defend Professor Larry Summers of Harvard University when he got himself into trouble after speculating about the reason more men than women excel at very high-level mathematics. Kimura was interested in scientific fact, not politics. In a report on her research, she was quoted as regretting the insistence on equality of outcome in STEM fields. This is what she said. Quote, engaging in coercive social engineering to balance the sex ratios may actually be the worst kind of discrimination, she claimed. It also serves, she went on to say, to entice some people into fields they will neither excel in nor enjoy, end quote. This last point about enticing women into fields they won't excel in or enjoy got me thinking about the flip side to feminist Professor Joel's insistence that research into sex differences is illegitimate, even dangerous. Maybe not pursuing sex differences is more dangerous. Now, I can understand Joel's concern to some small extent. If society accepts what seems to be the case, that there are more genius-level men than women in the field of mathematics, it's possible that there would be some discrimination against women wishing to study mathematics or to enter mathematics-related fields, such as engineering and physics. This is possible, as I say, but highly unlikely in our current gynocentric climate. After all, no one claims that there are no female math geniuses, only that there are fewer than male math geniuses. A society that values individual excellence will naturally honor and promote true math ability in women. Women should and will have the right, if they are intellectually equipped, to pursue mathematics-related work. The risk of discriminating against women in math seems vastly outweighed by the far more dangerous risks for women, men, and society overall of insisting on women's equal intellectual ability and thus of pushing women into such positions in the name of gender justice. I've touched on this problem in some previous videos, but I just recently came across an article in a publication called Academic Questions that gave this problem a name and an interesting backstory. The article is called, quote, Snowflake Jacobins, Black Rage on Campus. In it, the author, Russell Nieli, provided an explanation for the outburst of angry accusations and radical demands by Black students on American college campuses over the past couple of years. Nieli refers to, quote, a phenomenon long known to historians and social scientists that might be termed the Tocqueville effect, after its first extensive description by Alexis de Tocqueville in his book, The Old Regime and the French Revolution. De Tocqueville was an aristocratic French intellectual born in 1805, fascinated by democratic government, and best known for his book, Democracy in America. In the later work cited by Nieli, which was published in 1856, Tocqueville explained the conditions that cause people to engage in violent revolution, conditions which are not always linked to objectively real oppression. Instead, he found, quote, extreme anger and hostility are often the result of a, quote, revolution of rising expectations in which certain groups come to entertain exaggerated hopes of a better future, hopes that the actual conditions of life inevitably disappoint, end quote. So such unfulfilled expectations lead to frustration, bitterness, and outrage, which in turn lead to protests, demands for change, and even, as in some cases, riots and violence. Leaving aside the question of whether the theory does indeed apply to Black students on campus, we can see that feminists, too, have been shaped by a, quote, revolution of rising expectations, end quote. The fact is that the position of women in Western societies is very good by nearly any measure except the feminist measure. The feminist dream and confident prediction was that once barriers to women's participation were removed, women would flourish in intellectually demanding fields such as high-level maths. But women haven't flourished, at least not in the numbers feminists confidently expected. If we look at Nobel Prizes awarded since 1986, the year affirmative action hiring became federal law in Canada. That's why I chose it, though of course it doesn't apply to women in other countries. If we look at Nobel Prizes, we find that in the science categories, physics, chemistry, and physiology or medicine, women have won only 10 out of the 220 Nobel Prizes. That's about 4.5% of the total number of awards. To say that this is a disappointing outcome would be an understatement. It's not much different from women's performance in the bad old days of so-called patriarchal discrimination. In fact, in the years 1900 to 1920, women achieved 2 out of the 60 prizes in the same categories, about 3.3% of the prizes. So rising expectations among feminists have met the stubborn reality of female underperformance. If you're a feminist and you've accepted feminist claims that all of gender is a social construct and that assertions about cognitive difference are male supremacist fantasies only, then of course you're going to cry foul. You're going to believe that something's holding women back even though nothing is. Thus, feminists are forced to look for ever more subtle but supposedly powerful and omnipresent reasons why women are not performing equally to men. Sexism, sexism, and more sexism. And feminists use claims of sexism to justify yet more demands for special accommodations and artificial advantages. We have seen a plethora of recent articles claiming that science itself is sexist, that women's perspectives are necessary to save science, and that gender bias continues to bar women from fulfilling their potential. It's always the same mantra. More needs to be done for women. These predictable, formulaic, paper-thin complaints would be embarrassing and sad if they were not so socially destructive. A perfect, vicious circle with no end in sight whereby talented male scientists are barred from the enormously important and beneficial work they should be doing, and less talented women are shoehorned into positions for which they are not well suited, with a corresponding likelihood that they will, for a combination of reasons, feel resentment, anger, and a determination to bend the discipline to suit their needs rather than the requirements of science itself, and all because we are wedded to the false idea that gender justice can only be said to have been achieved when women occupy at least 50% of the most prestigious academic, political, and business positions, whether they're the best for the job or not. Maybe it's true that even 50 years after all the real barriers fell, we still don't know what women are capable of in these traditionally male-dominated fields. But it's a certainty that pretending we do know and mobilizing against so-called politically illegitimate research and mandating female numbers in STEM will never produce a rational, healthy, or just society.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please support us on Patreon. If even half of our subscribers gave us $1 per month, we'd be well on our way to creating more and better content. And don't forget to subscribe to us on Studio Brule.